So today, we are really honored to have my good old friend Indermit Gill, who's been really an important thinker for a very long time on issues of growth and development. He's now the chief economist of the World Bank. I think it's a fantastic appointment, and I think he's going to have a huge impact. We'll see it in his next World Development Report, which is going to be on the middle income trap, which is a really important topic. And he'll be moderated by Dany Bahar, by our own Dany Bahar. Dany is a graduate of the school. He got his PhD at the school, and he's also an MPAID from the school, and he's a professor at Brown. And so it's great. And he's a research fellow, a senior research fellow at the Growth Lab. So I'll have Dany and Indermit. It's an honor to have you, and I'm looking forward to your conversation.
So I'm just going to show you a few slides. No, I'm going to show you many slides, but the basic message is this one over here. The world is in a really bad state, and it's worse than last year, and there are even more risks now. So if that's not bad enough, if you look at the longer term economic prospects, they are actually worse than what they were before COVID, the 10 years before COVID, and those years were much worse than the first 10 years of this millennium, right? So essentially what you sort of see is declining potential for, so these are all things that you probably already know. I'm just going to prove them rigorously, right? The other thing though is that the one thing that you probably haven't heard is especially from somebody from the World Bank or the IMF, you don't hear who's responsible for this, right? So I'll actually tell you who's responsible for it. The third thing, of course, is that there are remedies, but these are very difficult remedies. And essentially, I think that the remedies are similar to what the Oakland A's were trying to do when they had lost, big stars like Giambi and others, and they were trying to sort of recreate some of these superstars in the aggregate, right? So you really need a lot of numbers and so on. And essentially what we have to do is we have to recreate China in the aggregate. Okay? So that's essentially the big solution. Okay, it's not an easy thing to do. All right, so I'm show you a few slides over here. So first, I'm going to just quickly talk about the next 2 years, or 2023 and 2024. So there's not likely to be a global recession, because global recessions don't happen unless the US goes into a recession, and we think that the US will not go into a recession, right? But we will actually probably end up having the 5 years of 2000 to 2024 are set to record the weakest global growth since the mid-1990s. Okay? And then, and the problem is that the growth is slowing down, but it's slowing down relatively, or slowed down relatively more in the poorer countries. So in fact, compared with the pre-COVID days, about a third of emerging markets and developing economies, EMDEs is emerging markets and developing economies, they'll still be actually at per capita income levels that are lower than what they had before the crisis, right, in 2024. There are some bright spots, right? And the bright spots are, the bright spots are mainly, they're mainly in East Asia and in South Asia, especially India. But other than that, it's really hard to sort of find bright spots. Okay, so here is what we were, here are the World Bank's projections for the world. As you can sort of see, is 2021, which was supposed to be a year of recovery, a rebound. We did have that, but then by essentially 2022, essentially what you got was growth was back to the pre-COVID decade, And since then, it's actually lower, right? And that's true of advanced economies, and that's true of emerging markets and developing economies. And it's true of emerging markets and developing economies, excluding China. China is somewhere in between this and this, which is why we always have a second category. Yeah. Okay, then if you look at inflation, as you can sort of see, everybody says that inflation is coming down. It is, but inflation is still much higher than what it was in the 4 or 5 years before the COVID average, right? And then, okay, so who's responsible for this, right? So this, I mean, the thing that you see over here is that the world is in a real mess, okay? So once you get to like around 2% growth, right? You're skating very close to the edge in the sense that you get one more hit and you go down below 1% growth and you've entered a global recession, right? So we're essentially in a big hole, right? Okay. Big holes are not made by small economies. Big holes are made by big economies, right? So if you sort of see, you actually sort of see these three big policy mistakes. The first one has to do with misdiagnosing inflation, right? The second one has to do with misdiagnosing a virus. And then the third one is misdiagnosing the energy imperative, okay? And you sort of see over here is, I don't want to sort of spell out all of this stuff, but you see for each one of these things, you actually sort of see mistakes being made. And what is actually very striking, Ricardo, is that you're not finding that you're now finding that the quality of economic policies is actually better in many emerging markets and developing countries as compared to those that we always thought had very good economic policies, right? The EU, the US, and by the way, China too. We always had a lot of trust in China because we always thought that, look, you know, we think that the quality of economic management in China is very good. Chinese data are terrible, but it didn't matter because you don't need the data because you have so much faith in the you have so much faith in the quality of economic management. Now that's not true anymore. So now you actually need data and you don't have it. Okay. Yeah. A third thing, I thought I'll say a few things about this one because so I used to think until last summer, I used to think that the EU has done really well in terms of cutting emissions, in terms of moving to cleaner energy and things like that, right? And I thought that the US had cheated, right? That basically what the US did was it didn't actually move out of fossil fuels. It just moved from coal to gas, okay? And that's how you can cut emissions by half if you just do that, right? And we were always sort of told, but Europe actually has done, it's moved out of nuclear, it's moved out of coal, it's gone into wind and solar and stuff like that, right? Well, then you had the invasion of Ukraine, you had all of the thing, and basically what you saw was that actually you found that the largest economies in Europe had not moved really out of fossil fuels. They just moved, instead of shale gas, they had moved to Russian gas. I'm talking about Germany and Austria and others, right? So they just moved into gas, but it was Russian gas, right? And then we were also sort of told, no, actually, if you look at electricity generation, depending on the day, actually Germany's electricity up to half, between a third and a half of it actually came from renewables, wind and solar and so on. But we were never told that that's not the full energy consumption because electricity is just 1/5 of the total. So if you sort of add it all up, if you actually looked at it before the problem started and so on, the amount that Germany was actually consuming, the share of Germany's energy needs that were coming from renewables was something like 6.3%, okay? The rest of it was all the usual stuff, okay? So in some sense, I feel that by sort of, by overestimating the speed of the shift to renewables, the EU got itself into a race, right? And when you actually had when you had a disruption in gas and oil and so on, you actually had problems. Now, things are improving, all right? So things have started to improve over time. One of that is that US CPI inflation has come down. And as you can sort of see, is essentially what has happened is that US services have proved to be quite resilient, okay? So they have proved to be quite resilient, but as you can sort of see, the trend is not particularly good there. The other thing you'll see is because of that misdiagnosis, which I mentioned to you, is if you sort of look at what has happened to expectations of interest rates, they've shifted up over time, right? They've shifted up between 6th of June and 21st of August in the sense that we were expecting that interest rates would be like this or federal funds rates would be there. Now they're higher, okay? And it's because inflation has proved to be much more resilient than people thought, or much more obstinate anyway. Okay? But you see, I spoke about the bright spots, and if you sort of see over here, I mean, here's the world, will grow roughly around 2%. This year and the next year. Then if you sort of look at emerging markets and developing economies, roughly twice that amount. But then if you start to sort of look at Asian countries, you sort of see higher growth rates. You'll see for the ASEAN countries, it's a little higher, it's around 4.5, 5. And then if you look at China, it's actually coming down from about 6 to about 4. And then India is staying up at around 6. And Indonesia is staying up at around 5. Okay? And these economies are doing well, but outside, it's really hard to find such stories outside of East and South Asia. Okay, so here's the upshot of it. The upshot of it is that if you sort of look at 5-year periods, and if you look at growth in emerging markets only, and you sort of see these were the good years here, and you see this is what we are projecting these 5 years to look like. And the only time they were any lower was in the early 1990s. Okay. And then if you sort of look over here, here's the world, here are emerging markets and developing economies, here are low-income countries, and these are fragile and conflict affected countries. And you see these are the shares of countries that will have a lower per capita income in 2024 as compared to before the pandemic. And you sort of see over here is that for the world as a whole, it'll be about a quarter. But for these countries, you see it'll be more like 2/3. And for low-income countries too, it'll be more than 1/3. So this is after 5 years. So, this is, basically a lost half decade, right? All right. All right. So that's what's happening now, a very short-term view of things. So what we also did was we actually we did a major exercise at the World Bank where we looked at what is the prognosis for growth, what is potential growth, right? So you have to sort of calculate this in you're using a whole bunch of assumptions and using a whole bunch of methods and so on. So we did that. We looked at all of the methods that central banks and others use to actually project potential growth. So potential growth is the growth at which an economy can grow without triggering inflation, roughly speaking, right? And basically what we found was, regardless of which way we were measuring all of this stuff, we found that potential growth rates in advanced economies were really coming down very, very rapidly. And the reasons are the ones that you kind of know, essentially demographics and other things, right? Yeah. And but this was not just the case only for emerging. It was not just the case for advanced economies. It was also the case for emerging markets and developing economies for a whole bunch of reasons, right? And for them, that growth potential was also coming down. And those were the main factors, of course. And then, so as I said, is that, how do you try to sort of get out of this? You try to get out of this by eking out a little bit of growth, extra growth from a whole bunch of economies, right? Like 1 percentage point more, 1 percentage point from India, from Indonesia, from Mexico, and from Brazil, and so on too, right? Okay. All right. So that's what we did. I just saying that. Oh, so all of this was, by the way, all of this is assuming a really optimistic situation in the sense that you shouldn't have any more crises. Okay. So if you had more crises, all bets are off. Yeah. Okay. And so here's what they look like. So this is for the world. You sort of see for this decade, the first decade of the thing, the second decade, and this is the third decade, right? and you sort of see everything coming down. For advanced economies especially, it goes from about 2 to 1. When you get to 1%, you're sort of skating on the edge of a global recession every year, basically, right? And then you see over here is that even for emerging markets and developing economies, you also sort of see this cut. It goes from about 6%. It was about 6% growth in the first decade. It went down to 5. Now it's 4. Okay, it's going to be 4, right? And this is the average that we had in the first 2 decades of the millennium. And you sort of see the average over there. From that, you can sort of see across the board, the only part of the world where you sort of see any good signs is South Asia, where you don't sort of see a big decline. You also don't see a big decline in sub-Saharan Africa. The problem is that sub-Saharan Africa wasn't very high to start with. And for sub-Saharan Africa, a 3% growth means that per capita incomes are not increasing. Okay. So basically, if it goes down below that, then per capita incomes start to fall. And as you all know, that the conditions, the social conditions, the economic conditions, and political conditions in a country where per capita incomes are falling are materially different from those where per capita incomes are increasing. Yeah. Okay, so then what we did was we actually broke this down and said, okay, how much of this is because of productivity? How much of this is because of capital? And how much of it is because of labor, right? And so you sort of see over here is that in general, it looks like it's across the board for emerging markets, right? So you sort of see this decline in the component of labor. And this is roughly speaking the demographic part, right? And then you see over here, this is the amount that comes from investment. And this is roughly speaking, the investment climate getting worse. You have debt overhangs, et cetera, that actually kill investment. And then this has to do with the efficiency of the economy. And as you see, even that, the rate of growth of the efficiency of the economy is actually also going down. Probably not so much between last decade and now, but definitely compared to the first decade, right? So then what I did was I asked the team to sort of give us the things for China. Right? As you sort of see, all of the dividends that came to China from essentially a growing labor force or growing thing will be gone, right? And then if you look at India, India looks stable, right? And then Indonesia also does okay. But in general, East Asian countries are starting to look more and more like this, where one of the drivers is not going to actually happen, okay? And then I also asked about Brazil and Mexico and South Africa. And as you see, I was surprised that actually, I was pleasantly surprised that actually this is not going down. It's actually looking okay. Mexico too, you know? I mean, so I'm trying to sort of find good news here, right? These are very, very small differences, almost in same thing, right? So South Africa, so I actually worked on South Africa recently, and South Africa really looks terrible because South Africa has the highest inequality in the world, one of the lowest growth rates in the world. They have the highest unemployment rates in the world, and now they have the highest electricity shortages, you know, and before the COVID crisis, their public finances were relatively stable. They're not anymore. So, you know, it's like 5 strikes. Okay. All right. So then you have remedies, all right? So, you know, how do you fix this? So we try to sort of see, okay, let's say that, say that each of the countries did what they did best, you know, take the best decade for each country, for each of these things, and say, you know, if they just replicated that performance, right, what would be the overall growth rate, right? If they just took the best reform years and they replicated those. So you end up essentially with this. So essentially you would get essentially an investment surge, you would get education and health improvements, give you that much, and labor and social benefit reforms. That can actually mean a lot, especially in countries like Turkey, in countries like India, and so on, where you actually have many women who are not actually in the labor force. So if you have labor reforms that actually bring them in, right, you actually do get this thing. So you can recover some of this. This is what I mean by Moneyball, okay? So you have to sort of have, a lot of countries do this, and they have to play really well as a team. That's the last thing. And that's really important too, because what that also means is that you ought to be actually trading with each other too, okay? The problem is that the trade as a share of world GDP is also going down, right? So all of these things are happening at the same time. So in general, you actually can come up with ways to sort of counter all of this. I'm taking too long, Dany, am I? No? Okay. Okay. So if you go back to this thing again, right? If you go back to this stuff again and you sort of say, okay, how much? So here, roughly speaking, you want to sort of exploit the digital dividends, okay? Here, roughly speaking, what you really want to do is you want to sort of say, can these countries exploit the opportunities that come from the shift to cleaner technologies, the carbon dividend, let's call it that, right? And then this one over here is really, I think, it's really, for most of these countries, I think it's really about using the talents of women more, right? You always end up with a policy implication where the women have to work harder, okay? Because we men are coming up with the policy implications, of course. All right, okay. Okay. So these are the risks. I won't go into too much into this. I can just tell you this, so I've been making a presentation sort of like this one here. And, we have this chart over here. And when I started my job, this just had like 4 or 5, And then every time they give me a new presentation, there's another one, and there's another one. So now I've started to sort of say, okay, out of all of this stuff, which ones are the ones that I'm really worried about today, right now, And I would sort of say, so really worried about financial stress in advanced economies, because a lot of these banks and so on had made bets that were assuming that interest rates were going to be low, and those bets are all off now, right? So that still worries us a lot. And when that happens, you get a big credit crunch, et cetera, and then everything goes wrong. And this is a huge thing, right? In the sense that because of the trade wars between the US, because of sanctions between the US and China, because of the sanctions on Russia and so on, you have this fragmentation of economic, and by that I mean sort of trade as well as financial networks. And if you sort of look at the period during which the world did really well, it was a period when you actually didn't have this fragmentation, between 1990 and 2015. Right? So you had the fall of the wall, and then you get this sort of a unification of global financial systems, and everybody prospers, or almost everybody prospers, right? But then, so you essentially, now you get this fragmentation again. And generally speaking, when fragmentation happens, it doesn't go into 2 fragments. It generally goes into 3. So you'll get the pro-US fragment, then you'll get the pro-China one, and then you'll get the Indias and all say, I don't want to belong to either one of these. I want to, so you get a 3rd fragment, right? So in the old days, it was called the Third World, the non-aligned movement, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And then, but this one, is super concerned about this one, because growth actually solves a lot of things. It solves the jobs problem. It solves the standard of living problem. It solves the climate action problem too, because you can do a lot more when you have growth than when you don't. Okay, so I will stop here, because otherwise then we won't have any conversation.
That was a fantastic presentation. So let me bring up a few things and hear your thoughts. And I'm going to ask you about the future. I know economists are terrible at predicting, especially the future. And you are the chief economist. So it seems like from seeing your slides, I was thinking, well, the world is going through long COVID. right? So these economic impacts from COVID and the mistakes that I like your framing, seems like we're now paying for these mistakes to some extent. You also mentioned some secular, determinants that are making the growth issue worse, like weak investment, debt overhang, and demographics. I wonder how much of even of these secular ones, at least the first two, are really part of repaying for the mistakes. How much of this is really structural, or how much of this are you optimistic that we're going to be able to get over it with some sound policies?
I think you've answered your question. I think you're absolutely right. One shouldn't sort of think of all of these as equally secular in that sense, right? So, for example, the debt part. I mean, there was a feel. We used to say that that if a low-income country had a public debt to GDP ratio of around 40%, it was skating close to the edge. A middle-income country, if it had it around 60%, it would be skating close to the edge, right? And then a high-income country, depending on where the country was, of course, it shouldn't be more than 80%, 60, 70% is good, right? Because you sort of keep a buffer. Somehow along the way, what happened was that we sort of changed that metric. We said, it doesn't matter if this country gets to 60% and so on. It was for a very simple reason. The world got used to very low interest rates. So the cost of actually financing this debt was relatively low. But we would always warn these countries that these things change very quickly, and when they change, especially since the maturities were relatively small, right? For smaller maturities, the interest rates were lower. So these countries had an incentive to borrow even lower, right? So then the question there was that this thing can come up very, very quickly. And very soon, what happens is that the best way to sort of see the problems is go back to the time when Paul Volcker raised interest rates in the United States, and look what happened. There were 24 countries that went bankrupt, okay? So you needed the Brady deal and the Baker deal, et cetera, et cetera. Something similar is happening right now. I can actually rattle off 24 countries that are either in debt distress or close to it, okay? And some of them, they're getting bigger and bigger, right? So it was Zambia and Chad, who cares, right? But then, it becomes Ethiopia and Ghana. You start to care now. Then it becomes Egypt, okay, Pakistan, Argentina, etc. Right? Argentina is always there, so we always factor. I should. That was a low blow. Sorry, a cheap shot. Sorry. So you're right. So that part. So I think some of it is this sort of. It's the mistake of thinking that low interest rates will be there forever, and so on. So the second thing I think is. So I would say the truly secular thing is probably just the demographic. That's it.
One thing that we didn't talk, you mentioned a little bit the fact that trade might be weakening a little bit, and there's the sanctions part, but there's also this a few ideas around it, right? There's the idea that also kind of a long COVID effect of reshoring, right? So the idea that particularly rich countries will want to bring back certain industries that were already offshored. And that came already from a big backlash against globalization that has been going on for a while. So I wonder how much of that do you buy, or how much of that do you see really happening, kind of going back in globalization? And if that's the case, is this making it worse for developing countries, or there could be opportunities?
So, trade, there's one trade that's trade generally speaking. The other one is trade that involves China, right? So here, take a look. Yeah. So, here's China, right? So essentially what has happened is that the shares in the changes in the share of US imports, right? So you get this big hit over here that essentially these are because of tariffs and so on, right? Starting with Trump, but continuing after that, right? And then you sort of see is, okay, well, that's not so bad because you can actually offset a lot of this stuff, at least in the short run. You get a Vietnam that comes up, Taiwan that comes up, Korea and so on. And then, you start to sort of see even India is responding to this. And we Indians take a little bit of time, but then we are a big country. So once we sort of get into it, it could actually end up being. The problem, Dany, is that there are other things with this trade that happen with China. So, for example, here is some work that our guys have just finished, is that they've looked at what has happened to the patent applications at the EPO, WIPO, and USPTO, right? For Chinese firms, as well as for US firms that were involved in it. And you sort of see, as soon as you start to sort of see these tariffs and all coming in, you start to sort of see these patent applications dropping to both sides of the Pacific, okay? So you start to sort of see this. And then if you sort of also look at this and you sort of say, if you look at the source of backward citations, right? So here's the US here, so here's Japan and so on, and here are the others, and this is China back in between 1996 and 2001. Fast forward to this, you see China has become a much more important part too, okay, of this. So all of this stuff is threatened. That's one thing. The other thing that I don't have slides to show over here, Dany, is that China is like the Saudi Arabia of renewables now, right? So if you look at the share of things that you need for solar and for batteries and for wind turbines and so on, a massive amount of that is being supplied by China. So when the US tells the US and others sort of say, we want you to speed up the transition to clean energy, and we want you to stop trading with China, that's cognitive dissonance, okay? You really have a problem there. You can't do both.
If I get it right, you're more worried not only about trade per se, but everything that trade brings with it.
Yes.
Namely innovation, particularly for developing countries.
Yeah, so, and the other thing is when we look at trade, for example, at the crudest level, one should actually look at trade in goods and trade in services. So, for example, you actually find that there is perhaps a big upside on trade and services, But then if you sort of start to sort of look at the services trade policy restrictiveness and so on, you actually find that this needs to come down a lot, And a few countries have made changes and also, but like India, for example, is one of the most restrictive. China is relatively restricted. Indonesia is restricted. That's it. So all of these countries that we think of as like great traders are actually, especially China and so on, they're actually very restrictive on the services side. And this is essentially a difficult thing. Now, even if you want to increase productivity growth in manufacturing, you need to sort of liberalize this. Yep.
Well, I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it up for everybody. And I'm going to stay standing because this looks like a good, looks like a political debate.
As long as I'm on the right side.
I want to ask you about job creation. Job creation, talking about politics, is the one thing that you hear from everybody on the left, on the right, in developing countries, developed countries. We care about good jobs. And there's like a bunch of earthquakes happening right now in the world in terms of the future of work, right? So there's the idea of remote work, where we're still trying to understand how is that gonna, that was kind of fueled by COVID, but it's gonna be here to stay. There's like AI tools all over. So I wonder if, this is a tough question, but I wonder if you have any thoughts or what should be the right framework to think about whether these are opportunities for developing countries or they're actually gonna bring some good challenges.
So three quick responses on that one, and then we can take other questions, Dany. So the first one is, because the demand for labor is a derived demand, it comes from the demand for goods and services. You have to sort of look at that, and it takes you back to growth. So for example, there's this big debate in India about trying to sort of get more women into the labor force and so on. And one of the things that people are saying is that part of the reason is there's just not enough pressure on wages because job growth is not increasing that much, right? So India probably needs to grow not at 6%, but at 8, 9% and so on. And at that point, then you start to sort of see a pressure on wages because job growth is going up, and then you sort of pull women into the labor force. So first part is that one. The second part I guess the other part is that, in general, what you sort of say is interventions to sort of, how does one speed up job growth? I've always said, and it's never been a popular idea, that essentially that the policies of government should be much more focused on job destruction, helping people whose jobs are destroyed, not working as much on the job creation side, because governments do that terribly and the private sector does it rather well. So you leave that to the private sector and just make sure that you sort of mitigate the pain of job destruction. Then the third point is the one that you mentioned about new technologies, right? So I actually sort of did some work sometime back about thing, and we actually wrote this up in a thing. So if you look at these general purpose technologies, AI and machine learning and so on is a general purpose technology. And there is always a dread that whenever a new GPT comes, there's always a dread that jobs will be destroyed, right? So for example, the first GPT was the steam engine, right? And people were worried about job destruction. The second GPT was electricity. And people again were, and actually jobs were destroyed. So for example, if you look at some of these things, they actually led to huge job destruction in agriculture and so on, right? And then the third GPT was information technology. And that there was also this worry that, and then the fourth GPT now we are talking about is AI, machine learning, and so on. So again, so you actually look at this and say, well, these fears seem to be overblown because the world has been through these things many times, right? But then when I sort of actually looked at some of the data done by people, I'm trying to remember the names of the authors, but they've done some really good work that I try to sort of look to see how long does it take for a GPT to get mainstreamed in production, right? If you look at that, you actually find that the steam engine took about 80 years, okay? If you look at electricity, it took about 40, okay? If you look at IT, it took about 20. So if that is a rate of progression, and that's the Gill rule, please call it the Gill rule if you think, because I made that up, right? But if that happens, that means that this one, when it comes, it'll be 10 years. That's too short a time. For these up to 20 years, you can still adjust, 40 years, of course you can adjust. So it's not so much about jobs being destroyed, it's much more about how much time do people have to switch to other things. And I think that's the worry. The worry is that this one won't give us enough time. The other part of it is that, you could sort of look at this thing about why is it that people are really much more concerned about AI and so on. Another way to sort of think about it is that the first GPT sort of worked on worked on essentially lowering the pressure on your legs in terms of walking long distances and so on. And then if you sort of look at electricity, so as you sort of keep going up like that, it goes to hands after that. And then AI is about the brains. And so all these brainy people over here are really worried about AI coming, right? You weren't worried about electricity and so on, but AI you're worried about because it's going to replace your brains, Yeah. And it will. Because you came to the wrong university. You had to go to a place that actually taught you how to analyze these things.
They came to the Duke of the North.
I wasn't talking about Duke. I'm wearing maroon. It's not crimson. Yeah.
There you go.
Okay.
So let's open up for a question. I think it's best if we take a few at the same time, so to give more opportunities. So should we take 3 or 4? And we have one there. We have one there. We have a microphone. So introduce yourself quickly and make sure you end up with a question mark at the end.
Thank you. I am Pradeep. I teach economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, India. So it was very pleasant this because not much of econometrics, even if I know a bit, but you addressed very well. Once in one of the slides you said about multiple risks. And I am little surprised to see that again you have highlighted only the older things. Like we keep studying from my masters, even you also, financial stress, fragmentation, weaker long-term growth prospectus, but not the tensions are not coming from other things like climate, geopolitics, because that seems to be very tension to me, like the way I understand the economy changing. Is it that we are not capturing the data the way we need to capture on those aspects and its impact on economic growth? Or is it something like, it's not very the way I understand the things by readings. So it's not actually convincing me the way that is being told here. Thank you.
I think you're right. I think you're right, both in terms of some things being more measurable and so on, because you can see it in high frequency indicators and things like that. And then the second one is also the ones that we sort of see are faster moving, So it takes hard, anyway. But you're absolutely right. I got the same comment from the finance minister of Indonesia 2 weeks ago. Same comment on this one. Exactly what you said. So you're in good company.
Hi, I'm Siu. I was a recent MPID graduate and I'm a research fellow at CID now. I was a bit more curious when you talked about the bright spots of India and Indonesia. What, in your opinion, are they doing right to maintain the higher levels of growth? Because like you said, how India, for instance, has had declining labor force participation from women, and how does that compare with some of the remedies in women participation and carbon investments that you said? So what are they doing right, and how does that compare with what you have suggested?
Let's take a couple more, and I'll remind you of the question. So we have one next, right next, the gentleman right there.
Hi, Jason. I'm a fellow at the Belfast Centre. I'm just interested if there's anything in particular you want to hear out of the G20 this weekend, or you don't want to hear, or whether you think it doesn't really matter.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk today. So I'm Jay. I'm a big fan of economics, but an even bigger fan of baseball. And I was curious about your analogy to the Oakland A's and China. And in particular, so you brought up Giambi leaving the A's, who's this big player, and then has to have a lot of little players fill his void. And I'm curious for China, are you looking at the demand side in that Chinese demand is falling and the resistance to use fiscal stimulus, the supply side with COVID and supply chain shocks, both or neither for what the smaller countries have to replicate?
This is the danger of playing to a gallery of one, because I knew that Ricardo likes analogies like this. So I came up with this one, but I didn't think it through. That's the difference between Ricardo and me. He thinks it through before he says it. Okay.
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Yeah, so I can start with that one. So I was just saying that essentially what we really need to do is we need to get like 1 or 2 percentage points, 1 percentage point more from India, 1 percentage point more from Indonesia, and so on. And if you aggregate all of that stuff, that then offsets this decline in potential growth in China, right? You have to multiply this by about 20 trillion, but you need to sort of add all these. That's what I meant, in the sense that you sort of get, smaller players to step up the game a little bit, right? But then remember, you also have to get these smaller players to trade with each other the way China, because a large part of the China sort of big boom was the fact that it was trading, a lot of efficiency, a lot of knowledge flows and so on. That trading part is really hard, in the sense that the teamwork part, right? Which I don't think was quite there in Moneyball, because they were just breaking it down by, each person, right? The only team aspect of it was that they were supposed to sort of, it didn't matter whether or not you got on first base because of a walk or a hit, you just got on, right? Yeah. Okay.
Let me add there, I'm going to remind you of the other two, but let me add, there's a question for Zoom that I think is a good follow-up, which is what changes in US policy are needed, you think, to support a global re-engagement of China?
That's a tough one. I thought if you ask me what changes in US policy generally, I think that, pressing both the brake and the accelerator at the same time is a really bad idea. So you're going to take your foot off the accelerator, right? And I'm talking about the fiscal accelerator and the monetary brake, so I think that's part of the problem here. But in terms of that one, let me think about that.
Okay.
Let me think about that.
We had a question about India and Indonesia. What are they doing right? And a question about the G20.
India, I think that one of the things that you sort of see from this right away is that if you sort of look at the growth of the labor part, that says steady in India. It's kind of says steady also in Indonesia, right? So that's one of the things. I think in a sense, these two economies were actually relatively inefficient, right? So Indonesia has just roughly now reached upper middle income status. India is still halfway through lower middle income. So they should be growing faster. So it's not as if, in fact, I think that India and all should be growing a little bit higher than this one, right? Now, Indonesia, so this is something, I don't know if they've been talking with you, Ricardo, but they have some really bad ideas. So they want to create an OPEC for rare nickel and lithium and so on. So I figured Ricardo must have told me talk with them about it. Anyway, I guess it seemed like a quintessentially Venezuelan idea, which was I'm saying that. So, but they have commodities. So they actually, even though they have commodities and they have relatively low labor force participation, right? That's one. I think India, the other part that India is on the digital technologies and so on. So I was told by Nandan Nilekani, who is I guess he's the father of Indian IT. And he was saying that what India has been doing is that, India created this unique identity card, universal identity card, right? And the world sort of thought this was, as the world took some time to catch up to that, right? By the time they caught up to it, actually what India had done was it had actually used that as a platform to cut financial transactions a lot, the cost of financial transactions a lot. As a result of it, it made sense for these banks to actually reach out and include people in the financial systems who had very small accounts, because the cost of each account went down massively, right? So the world has caught up to that too. And what Nandan was saying, well, actually, we moved on to another part of it now. What we've moved on is that what we are trying to do is we are trying to help poor people or low-wage people use the digital footprint as capital. So, for example, they can actually, that you can actually sort of get a lot of banks to bid for your services by giving them temporary access to your digital records so that they know exactly what your income and your expenditures and all have been. And you can even, say, for example, you have an auto rickshaw driver. That auto rickshaw driver can actually get a loan, which is repaid every time the guy actually gets money from somebody because he's getting everything digitally, So they've actually already moved on to that. So that's another reason why I feel like India could actually, think. So that part has to do with this part of the Indian growth, right? And then, under Modi, and this is open to debate, but under Modi, you've had an improvement in the business climate as well. And people are sort of thinking that some of those things are going to be permanent, So as a result of all of those things, Indonesia, I don't know as well, but Indonesia has a serious problem of infrastructure links between the different islands. So if they invest in that, they're going to get a huge, huge productivity debate out of that. Well, there was one more question.
A question about the G20.
The G20. If they only did one thing, which is that if they only agreed on a way to help countries that are in debt distress quickly, the G20 common framework is neither. Okay, it's not a framework and it's not very common, right? Okay, so you have to have something that is actually not country by country and so on, because country by country debt treatments screw the weakest countries, So it took Zambia 2.5 years, and they still haven't actually got any debt relief, but it took Zambia 2.5 years to actually get to a point where it can now dream of debt relief. Meanwhile, Zambia went from being an upper middle income country to a low income country, So this happens all the time. And I feel that with the interest rates rising in the US and so on, we're going to get a very similar thing. It won't all be in Latin America as well as the Philippines and a few countries. It'll be spread out all over the world, but you're going to get this problem. And given the fact that we don't have that kind of a mechanism, that the G20 is not going to do it, right? Because they can't, because it's a consensus-driven organization, and China won't agree, right? Because of that. And one, China won't agree. The other one is that France will not agree to actually disband the Paris Club and say, why don't we ask the World Bank and the IMF to actually intermediate these deals rather than it being done in the Paris Club, The Paris Club was, the Paris Club is this arrangement that the French lead, where essentially creditors, they all get together and they actually decide the terms of debt relief for countries that are poor, right? Mainly in Africa, but also in other places. But the problem is that the amount of debt that is owed to these countries that belong to the Paris Club is now a smaller and smaller fraction. It's less than a third, all right? It's actually less than a quarter now. But they still maintain the fact that, so they are, they are basically playing around with Chinese money and Saudi money and Turkish money and Indian money, right? And these other countries say, we don't like this. So basically they need to come up with this, and there's going to be this impasse both on the French and the Chinese side. So that would be the one thing I would say.
Let's do another round of questions. We have one here, here, and one over there, Chalk behind you.
Hi, my name is Adwa. Thank you for the presentation. I know you're doing important work on the middle income trap, and I was wondering, I wanted to get your thoughts on this phenomenon of the missing middle, which are the population right above the poverty line who don't get social protection. I was wondering if there's any interventions that you think the government or social sector can do and provide to support this population, this very vulnerable population, other than social protection, other than taxes, something that's maybe behaviorally driven. Thank you.
We have
How much
one.
time do you have? Because we are actually, we are doing a whole big report on this issue. And you should talk with Shomek. He'll give you a lot of stuff on this one. Absolutely right. But you're spot on.
Get that one on the back.
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name's Nalini, and I'm an MPP. So this graph is really interesting, and I love the decomposition between labor, capital, and productivity. And what stands out is that productivity is declining across all these countries. We've recorded a global productivity slowdown, but amidst in all these crises and COVID, it feels like there really is no solution to boosting that productivity. And I think boosting productivity would help lift China or like some of the more advanced countries as well. So wondering if you had any insights on what would be that catalyst. Do you think it's AI, or do you think it's something else, or what will be that step change in growth for the world?
Yeah.
We have one here. Sorry, I want to bombard you with questions. And
No worries. It's good. Because please.
My question is about the industrial transition that's kind of supported by subsidies. So we're sort of seeing not a race to the bottom, but every country is kind of racing to provide a set of subsidies so that the whole green transition takes place in their geographies. So my question is, when these subsidies end, what does it mean for the productivity landscape when like the efficiencies, when the subsidies are removed and the efficiencies come back to parity? What does it mean at that point when like capital stocks have depreciated? Is it going to lead to efficiency problems? Do you see this as a necessary step towards the green transition? Just your thoughts on that.
It's a purely hypothetical question because the subsidies never end. No, I'm kidding. But I had a slide that actually sort of said that in fact this is a problem, what you just said. And the worry is that a lot of this is being done by countries in the guise of the green transition, but it's actually just a protectionist measure. And if that is true, then I've coined a phrase, which is that it is simultaneously shameless and shameful. Okay. Yeah, but so I think it's a real danger because it basically then means that because these things will then take some other form and so on, right? So I think this is another thing that the G20 could actually try to discipline this. But the problem is that the body that actually would have actually overseen this well and so on is the WTO, and the WTO is pretty toothless right now. Yeah.
we had one on interventions for very vulnerable populations, other than traditional interventions, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah. Are you talking about?
Let me add another question to that, because one we have from the chat that I think is related. We have a question all from Uganda, from a listener in Uganda, asking also particular about policies for labor market inclusion of female, of women. A bit two different things, but you might combine them.
So, there's this old Chinese saying, I think, is that Indians never write things down, and then when they're pressed for details, they invariably resort to storytelling. So, so I'm going to tell you a story. The story is from Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia, actually, we've been working a lot with Saudi Arabia to increase labor force participation of women. Yeah. And what happened was that they've actually changed quite a few laws and so on. We have something called the Women Business and the Law Report, right? And, we actually got a lot of pushback from the Saudis initially, and then this just basically adopted these things. And, they kept changing things like, inheritance rules, the fact that that essentially women could drive, etc. Right? But the timing of this was great. The timing of it was that they actually made all of these changes, and then COVID came. And when COVID came, a lot of the workers, the migrant workers, actually returned to their countries. When COVID restrictions were lifted, a lot of those jobs actually ended up going to Saudi women, like sales jobs and so on. So you actually sort of see this massive improvement in female labor force participation in Saudi Arabia. Some of it is luck, but some of it is definitely the hard work of removing some of these things. The story from Saudi Arabia essentially illustrates that you can actually do these things, that these things, can happen in places where you wouldn't have thought the odds were very high. And then you wouldn't have thought that the speed would be very fast, and both of those things happened, right? Now, in the case of India, there's a lot of analysis on India on this one, and I think there's some really nice, analogies between India and Bangladesh, and actually between West Bengal and Bangladesh, where you actually sort of find that female labor force participation in Bangladesh is twice as high as that in West Bengal. And normally speaking, we think of Muslim societies as having lower labor force participation. In that case, they're actually higher, right? So I think that in the case of India, so I was talking about this, one of the problems in India is that northern India is like a very safe suburb when it comes to public security for men. And it's like an inner city when it comes to public security for women. Public security is a huge problem, especially in northern India. And by the way, in northern India is where 10% of the world's population lives, right? That's the thing. And there are a whole lot of other things. The one part that I find, Ricardo, is that, so I never sort of really paid a lot of attention to the caste system in India, mainly because of my religion, where we are actually not supposed to have castes and so on, but probably because of ignorance, right? But the more I worked on India, the more I realized the caste system has a lot to do with all of this stuff. And we can sort of, so this is 5,000 years old, so it's really going to be hard. But I think it's very related to the labor force participation of women and so on, because labor force participation of women is relatively high in the lower castes. It's lower in the higher castes, So how does one sort of fix that? It's a tricky problem. Yeah.
There was another very easy question for you here. And I want to note also the presence of Shomik Lal here, who is visiting for the day, who's leading the World Development Report for next year. So I know Shomik has thought a lot of these issues too.
And it's looking at exactly the problem that you mentioned, that when countries become middle income, they end up having these three pathologies. The first one is that they end up having not enough mid-sized firms. The second one is not a large enough middle income, not a large enough middle class. And then the third one that we sort of see is that they actually end up using energy sources that are on either end of the spectrum, either very clean energy like hydro and stuff like that, or very dirty energy like coal. And compared to higher income countries, they end up using mid-carbon fuels a lot more, like gas. Yeah. And I'm really thankful to you for not saying that my story was wrong. It's true, right? Yeah.
There was an easy question for you about what do you think is the next boost for productivity? What is going to cause the next boost of productivity? If I rephrase it a little bit.
So in 6 months, Shomik will give you a really good answer to this. But I think one of the things is that, it goes back to this thing about how we think about productivity growth, right? So we might think about it as within firm. We could think about it as new firms coming in, and so on. Sometimes we also sort of say, large firms tend to have lower productivity growth and smaller firms have higher productivity growth. I think Shomik's report is questioning all of this stuff in a very, very nice way, in a very compelling way, because better and better data, So in fact, for example, it has to do with, how do you make sure that you discipline the incumbents, whether those incumbents are large firms, whether those incumbents are the elites, or whether those incumbents are state-owned enterprises that actually prevent a large part of the energy transition. Okay, but you have to work with them. It's not a question of somehow trying to sort of say that we're going to get rid of these guys. You'll always have the elites and so on. So how do you sort of make sure that you actually have you have a group of elites, or you have a group of incumbents that are pro-innovation rather than? So that's part of the answer to what your question.
So sorry, just to recap. So you largely think it relates to competition policy then, and how to improve dynamism between the businesses?
Well, definitely that, except that one of the things that Shomik has taught me is that there is no place where you're going to get perfect competition, right? So you have to sort of figure out a good way to make imperfect competition work. So competition policy better be, so it has to be premised on that point, that you're going to have, that there's not going to be any place where you'll have perfect competition. And then how do you design competition policy that is alert to all of these dangers about elite capture, about all of these things, right? But he's the man. He's the man you should ask this question.
So I'm told that we have time for one more question, and Powers invested in me. I decided I'm going to ask it.
Okay.
But I think it's going to be useful for everybody. So I think we have here a lot of people who are going to be looking for starting very meaningful careers on development in general, but beyond that. So we want to pick your brain on what's your best piece of advice in terms of like what are the most exciting things to be thinking of in terms of development work, jobs in development in the World Bank and outside the World Bank.
So the first thing is the best place to work if you want to work in development. Okay, there are two best places. One is you work in a developing country. If you decide you don't want to work in a developing country, then you work at the World Bank. It's the best place, okay? It's a really good place to work. So you should sort of make sure that you know what the World Bank is doing and so on. It's not the only place, but I think it's the industry leader in international development for no other reason. The World Bank has this, I guess the niche of the World Bank is that it has no niche. It has to cover the full spectrum of development problems, all the way from monetary down to religious, I don't know, So it has to sort of cover it all. So in that sense, pretty much anything that you're going to be working on, the World Bank is interested, Now, the one thing that I do know is that if you all want to sort of work on the sustainable energy part and so on, you should know it's a crowded field, okay? A lot of people want to work on those things. If you want to work on those things, then make sure that you have a skill that other people don't have. And that usually means a technical skill. It usually means an unpleasant thing, something that other people, because pleasant things everybody wants to do, right? So it has to be something unpleasant. It's usually some technical stuff. It's trying to figure out what Ricardo is really saying and that kind of thing. Right? That's not easy, right? But if you figure that out, then you have a skill that people want. That technical skill gets you that first job, okay? And then the World Bank proceeds to destroy that technical skill until you have none left.
All right, well, let me thank you on behalf of all of us for this excellent talk and for your time.